Your point on Steve Jobs, I think, is a really poignant one because Steve Jobs, to me, being like the visionary that he was, is the classic example of two schools of thought against each other. Nowadays, the major school of thought in business and probably design in general is that of incrementalism, where it's like, okay, we launch XYZ thing and then we get a bunch of data and we use that data to slightly change the designs and slightly change the features and the functionality. And in that way, we're 5% better in February, another 5% better in March, 5% better in April, and so on and so forth. So Amazon, for instance, does this. They run so many tests and heat maps and various, mechanisms to determine user preferences and whatnot across their apps. Then they, tie that in and then improve it a little bit and then look at that next sort of generation. Steve Jobs isn't like that at all. He took a few very strong bets, very seldom, just a couple of times in his life, and he was just bang on with that. And to me, that's the difference between a local optimum choice and a global optimum choice. A lot of people get stuck in locally optimal choices. I see this a lot in content creation. They make a choice, which if you just isolate that choice and you black out everything else, and you're just looking at like, hey, here's the situation, make the best decision with the information you have available. They will make the choice to make that video, the piece of content, the blog post, whatever the hell, as good as they possibly can. They'll get as many views as they can, as much engagement as they can. They'll rise to the top of the search rank because it's like, holy shit, this is incredible. But if you zoom out and you realize that they do that independently for every video, every piece of content, what you end up with is this like disparate kind of channel that talks about just like the most trending topics that are online. And there's no connection between the two. And you're just doing things for primarily clickbait reasons that, obviously work really well in the individual point or sense, but don't really work well outside of it. And that locally optimum choice is like very different from the globally optimum choice, which is where, you're capable of taking a couple of hits. But then if people zoom out and evaluate you as a whole, which most people will, as they get more into your ecosystem, they actually, you are a better channel as a result. It's like that idea of winning the battle but losing the war. And I think this works the same across products. I think it works the same across a lot of things. It requires somebody disruptive, willing to take a risk and see things from like a bigger picture. And if you can weather a few, short-term storms, like I'm sure Steve Jobs did when he was pitching this shit to like his whole board, everybody was like, what are you, crazy? A phone with no buttons? Why the hell would anybody do that? If it lands, it lands.
Yeah, you have to be willing to take short-term losses to get long-term bets. And the thing about the big opportunities is basically the biggest opportunities of today look like risks. But when you're looking backwards, they look obvious. But today they look like actual risks. Yeah, you got to play these infinite games, right? Where you take a bit of a longer-term perspective and sacrifice the short-term for it. And he did that. You are right about, making decisions in a vacuum. And like, I'm sure he could have, there was every reason not to do what he did, but he did it anyway because he had a belief system. And I think it's good that you have these bets where you're like, you have a real think about what do I believe to be true and what do I believe to be true in 12 months. And then you go all in on that thing, despite what is or is not popular. Like I always come back to this Johnny Depp thing. The Savage stood by him and they weathered a huge storm and they came out so freaking loved and popular. I remember going on their Instagram feed and everything was like W Savage, and their brand value went through the roof. But like, if you look at it like a decision they made at the time in the week, they were getting completely blasted. So there is something to be said for that long-term thinking there, 100%.
Damn, I didn't really think about it in that context, but yeah, that is so true. It's like having some sort of prevailing faith or belief, well, not faith, obviously like evidence-based, first principles and reasoning-based beliefs that, XYZ thing will pay off. And isn't that what all visionaries throughout history have needed? Because in the short term, any sufficiently disruptive action does appear like madness. I don't know if this is going to pan out, but in the last year, we've heard a lot of people talking about pushing data centers to space and then using solar for these little like satellite-based things to, get a bunch of energy from the sun. Obviously, they're closer. There's no atmosphere. There's no nothing. And then they like train models and create this distributed swarm and fleet. I know Elon Musk was talking a lot about this, and everybody's like, what are you freaking crazy? That doesn't make any sense. What about the heat dissipation and whatnot? Clearly, he saw something a little fundamentally different, but he did not stop talking about it for a while. And I don't know any of the engineering behind it, but I think that's probably a similar sort of bet. It's like, well, yeah, why would we do that if we could just like find a space on Earth that is, not nowhere near as used and then just like build a bunch of data centers there? And he's like, let's just rethink it all entirely.
He did. And it's exactly what Jensen Huang did. They reasoned it from first principles and they asked the questions. And like, you look at the bet, if everyone hasn't seen the podcast with Jensen Huang and Lex Friedman, I strongly encourage you to do so. It's fantastic. But it basically talks about that NVIDIA, Fatih Tildiara, made a huge bet when they were a multi-billion-dollar company. And they said, look, we believe, like they said, like they started up from like, okay, grass is green. We'll agree with that. And they worked their way up to like this viewpoint that was like essentially mainly in contradiction to what everyone was thinking and doing. And they made a decision that cost them billions of dollars. I think that they became worth about 20% of what they currently were. But that decision enabled them to 100x and then some. It turned out to be one of the best decisions ever made. I won't spoil the story, but go and watch it. But that's basically the TLDR of it. But they reasoned it from first principles. They just didn't follow what everyone else was doing, and they made a bet on that. And I think many of us probably don't create the own headspace for ourselves to think about what are the first principle bets that I should be making and being comfortable with being wrong, actually, as well. Because I think if you really want a breakout moment, you have to be comfortable with getting it wrong. You may get a few failures along the way. That is the pathway to success ultimately. But I think, if you actually apply that as a kind of razor to thinking, that's how you 10x.